Um, Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this beautiful Saturday morning. And thank you also to the organizers for bringing a festival as wonderful as the JLF to North Carolina. And how? Because we have amongst us Dr. Shashi Tharoor, and we're going to have a conversation about one of my favorite books of his, which is The Inglorious Empire. So, Dr. Tharoor, we know that it's been a while since the book came out, but the force of its argument that there is a very critical need to engage with British imperial history remains very relevant and deeply resonates till this date. I was thinking, let's start at the beginning. If you could talk and recount for our audience today some of the very interesting but also unusual origins of this book.
Sure, thank you, Avrati, and good morning, everyone. Good of you to spend a Saturday morning here talking about a book I published 8 years ago, but I'm glad it's still being read and people still seem to be interested in continuing to talk about it. You know, it began with a speech, oddly enough. I've heard, people making speeches about books, but the first time the book came about because of a speech. I was actually invited to participate in an Oxford Union debate. Every successive batch of students keeps inviting me, and I almost never go. But this time the timing was convenient because it was en route to the Hay Literature Festival where I was speaking. So my sister, who lives in London, said, no problem, I'll drive you through Oxford. We can spend the night there, break the journey, do your debate, and the next morning we'll get to Hay. And I said, that sounds like sense. So we did that. And the topic they gave us was Britain owes reparations to her former colonies. Now, I'm not a big fan of reparations for various reasons. The principal one being that the amount of damage that British colonialism did, which at that point I thought was impossible to quantify. Subsequently, in fact, a scholar in London has done a quantification and come up with the astronomical figure of 45 trillion pounds, which is literally 15 times the British GDP. So you can imagine how much. But what I said at the time, without knowing that number, was that no credible amount would be payable, which of course it's not, and no payable amount would be credible. So I actually suggested that far more important than reparations was moral atonement. I'll come to that in a minute. But what I wanted to say had to fit into their topic. So I said, all right, a reparation of £1 a year symbolically for 200 years might actually be a process of annual atonement for 200 years of colonial loot and exploitation. That, anyway, wasn't the whole thrust of the speech. I actually spent my allotted time and then some, because they didn't ring the bell, they seemed to be enjoying it so much. I spent that time essentially refuting the arguments made. I was the last speaker for the proposition. And I also used that opportunity to sort of bust some of the myths about British colonialism. Anyway, made the speech, went on to Hay, forgot about it. We won the debate very handily. In fact, the British have the system of division lobbies. So what happens is that after the debate, you don't vote with a show of hands, you move into the yes lobby or the no lobby. These are two physical rooms. And so many people were moving into the room that we had allotted, as it were, to us, that they eventually ended up delaying the official reception afterwards by half an hour because there were so many people. So we won the debate very handily, but still I forgot about it, went on to Hay. And about 6 or 7 weeks later, the Oxford Union posted the debate on the web, and they sent me a link to my speech, and I, as I was wont to do, I tweeted it. And then suddenly it was some sort of incandescent miracle. About 3 million people downloaded the blessed thing in the first 24 hours. It was all over the place. People from the sort of BJP side of the political ecosystem, who usually on social media spend their time trolling me, decided to praise me instead, which was quite astonishing. Within a couple of days, there was an event in Parliament at which the Speaker saw fit to praise me. The Prime Minister, who was the next speaker, then took the floor and said, this was the example of somebody saying the right thing in the right place at the right time. Congratulations. Now, this became a huge, huge story in India. And I was utterly baffled by the extent to which I seem to have struck a chord, because I actually thought that what I was saying was what you might call nationalism 101. It was the sort of things that anyone who'd paid attention in history class and then done their readings ought to have figured out. So it wasn't, to my mind, something terribly difficult. But either people hadn't been paying attention in history class, or they had forgotten whatever it was they were supposed to have known. Because within a couple of days, I got a call from my rather excited, and he's normally a very tranquil and phlegmatic man, David calling, saying, "You've got," my excited publisher saying, "you've got to turn this into a book." And I said, "It's not necessary. Everyone knows the stuff. It's all there." And he said, "Wait a minute. If everyone knew all the stuff, why has your speech gone so viral? Clearly, people want to know, and it's your job now to write it." So I groaned and said, "All right, maybe that's probably true." But then I realized that the kind of stuff that I could toss off almost off the top of my head in what was meant to be an 8-minute speech and ended up being 15, was somewhat, less serious, as it were, than a book that would then be subject to the scrutiny of reviewers and scholars and people on the other side of the argument and so on. And so I ended up, for the first time, I'd published, God knows by then, 17 or 18 books, but the first time I actually engaged a small, rather modest battery of researchers, 3 of them to be exact. And I told them what my book was going to be about and what they needed to look for. A couple of them were interns, one was a retired professor. Anyway, what was interesting was that thanks to the modern digital age, I got a vast amount of material that was digitized and available that I could just read on a laptop, which is the big transformation. I did my PhD in the 70s, and believe me, going from library to library and archive to documentation center, pulling out big fat volumes, scrawling things down in little slips of paper, then rearranging the slips so that you could construct your argument, writing them. And those days were really tough by comparison with what it's like to write a book now. This was a breeze. But it was still a vast amount of material. I had over 10,000 pages of documentation on a hard drive, and I decided then to, for the first time again, because I always wrote on the fly, on evenings, on weekends. I notoriously wrote a couple of pages of the great Indian novel on the page, resting against the steering wheel of my car in the parking lot while my wife shopped and there was no parking available. But this was somehow a different experience. I actually had to sit around mastering a lot of stuff and battering it into some sort of shape. And this is where His Majesty the King of Bhutan came to my rescue and offered me what he modestly called one of his cottages or one of his palaces in the middle of Bhutan, absolutely far away from anywhere, where the Indian telephone system didn't work, so no one could disturb me. On top of that, I managed to twist an ankle or do something, bust my leg in some way. So even though my conscience told me I ought to be going for long walks on the hills in the countryside, as a practical matter, I couldn't after day one. So all I did was wake up in the morning and spend 18 hours writing. I even wrote through my meals. It was just, for me, a terrific experience, just getting over all of this material, forming something coherent out of it, and coming up with a first draft that in the end was only half what the book turned out to be, but I had the shape of the book. And I sent it off to my publisher. He was excited. And then all I had to do in the months to follow was to look at it. And so what had been written down as one chapter ended up becoming 2 or even 3, as I found more material and amplified it and so on. But the basic shape of the book was there. And when the book came out, I think it became hugely, hugely successful. It is to this day the best-selling non-textbook hardback of all time in India. And it even made it to the British Sunday Times bestseller list under a different title, Inglorious Empire, which is the title of the edition available in the US. The Indian title is An Era of Darkness, which was a deliberate allusion to Naipaul's An Area of Darkness, which is what he called India. But I needed to remind people like him how we got to be that dark. And it was the 200 years of British rule that preceded it.
Yeah, that's such a great way to sort of, I'm glad that you brought up the title, because when I think of the title Inglorious Empire, it's stark, it's uncompromising, and it's very provocative.
Yeah.
So was that the effect that you were hoping to achieve through that title?
I think since the Indian edition was principally intended for Indians, and though it was the same text and the same arguments, the British edition was going to have to be purchased and reviewed by English people. I think the English publisher was probably right to change the title. There is, again, this business of publishers having their own view on what attracts readers in their market. I mean, there's a book of mine that I'm rather proud of, but which didn't do quite as well because it came out during COVID, a book called The Battle of Belonging, which is about nationalism, patriotism, Indian identity, all the issues that have come up in our politics in recent years. But the British and American edition is actually called The Struggle for India's Soul. Now, for some bizarre reason, the bookshop up here seems to have the Indian edition available. But anyway, they know what kind of title would appeal to their book buyers, so that's what happened. But yeah, Inglorious Empire actually did more than strike a chord because of the shock of the title. I remember, for example, a British conservative peer, Lord Ridley, devoted an entire column of the London Times to praising the book and saying how marvelous it was that Indians were still willing to speak to us, the British kind of thing, after what we had done to them. And I didn't know the gentleman from anyone, but I did sort of realize that he was from a very ancient British family that descended from the Norman Conquest and was a hereditary peer of the realm and a Conservative Party member. So when I visited London later, I met him and we had lunch together. And I asked him, out of unabashed curiosity, how come you as a Conservative wrote this particular column about my book? And he said, because I'm a true Conservative. I believe we should have traded with you, not conquered you. Which was an interesting argument, considering that it started out that way. They came to trade, and they realized it was a heck of a lot more profitable to trade through the barrel of a gun. And that's really how it all started with the British East India Company. But anyway, that was the story there.
So we'll come to, I'm interested in this trade aspect of it and the company rule that you very well sort of lay out in your book. But before we go there, in your previous answer, you spoke a little bit about moral atonement.
Yes.
And then there's also this, and I'll raise phrases from the book. You talk about a moral debt. You talk about a moral urgency to engage with the history of the British Empire. And considering it's been a while since you made that call, do you think things have changed? Do you think, and I'll tell you where it's coming from, because I remember, and if I remember right, it was a reviewer from The Guardian who sort of said that the purpose of the book is the tempering of British imperial nostalgia with post-colonial responsibility. Do you think Britain has sort of reckoned with this responsibility?
I think the reckoning has begun, and I'm proud my book had a lot to do with changing that, turning the narrative. In the sort of 10 or 15 years preceding the publication of Inglorious Empire, the narrative in Britain had become entirely pro-imperialism. We had authors like Andrew Roberts, Neil Ferguson, Lawrence James, writing the most absurd arguments about how the British Empire was the greatest experiment in human altruism ever known to mankind, quote unquote, from one of those three. Ferguson argued that India's current success in the world of globalization is due entirely to the underpinnings that the British had laid down for it in their imperial years. All of this kind of twaddle. And what was striking for me was that was accompanied by the sort of soft, gauzy television narratives, you know, The Jewel and the Crown. And The Jewel and the Crown as a book is far more complex than the series. The Far Pavilions, all of this sort of very, very sort of rose-tinted view of the British imperial past. When I was writing my book, I was shocked to see that the most recent British YouGov poll, and YouGov particularly targets younger Britons, actually said that 59% of the respondents in that year, I think it was 2015, thought the British Empire was a good thing and they would love to have it back. And I thought, my God, you know, can you imagine Germans talking about wanting to have Hitler back and the Nazi? It was unthinkable. There was a British minister, Liam Fox, who said that Britain was the only country in the world that had nothing to apologize for in the 20th century. And I thought, hello, Jallianwala Bagh? the bombing of the Mesopotamians. You could draw up the way the Irish were massacred. You could draw up a list of war crimes and genocidal behavior as long as your arm, and nothing to apologize for. And then all of this nonsensical talk going on in Britain, I thought, it sort of made my blood boil a bit. And I said, yes, we do need to correct this narrative. Why moral atonement? When I was doing sort of tours in UK for the book, I argued that the moral atonement I wanted would consist of 3 or 4 things. The first was quite simply, that it was high time the British taught unvarnished colonial history in their schools. I met a Pakistani woman writer living in England who said that she just raised 2 sons in the best, most expensive, fancy public schools in England, in London, and they had both majored in history at A-levels, and neither had learned a single line of colonial history. And I thought, that's astonishing. I mean, the country has been built on the profits made from colonialism. Britain was really an impoverished sort of developing country when they went out and started conquering the rest of the world. So complete unawareness and unacknowledgement of it. Second, London is the world capital of museums. There's a museum you throw a stone, you'll hit a museum somewhere. Most of the museums are essentially what in India we'd call a chor bazaar. I mean, they are essentially there to showcase items purloined from the colonies they ruled and conquered. And they have the gall essentially to tell you, kindly pay money to us so that we can show you what our grandfather stole from your grandfather. I mean, this is what... So I said, you have an imperial war museum celebrating the glories of imperial conquest. How about a museum to colonialism that would actually depict the experiences of the colonized? Absolutely no such thing, no awareness, no consciousness. I remember going to, I had a German classmate in graduate school in America who told me that his father, who was obviously involved in the war, never mentioned the war, ever, at home. While he was growing up, he was born in the, I guess, around 1950, I should think. But he grew up in the 50s knowing nothing. I remember my wife and I were touring Germany in 1980. We wanted to see Dachau, the concentration camp, which we knew had been preserved. There was no sign to it. It didn't show up in any tourism maps in those days. And we had to go and ask, and they said, if you ask, yes, you can go. And when we were literally the only visitors, when we actually wanted to see the cell in which Noor Inayat Khan, the great Indian woman who was a resistance hero in France and was tortured and killed in Dhaka, had been kept. And so we went and saw all of that. Within a few years of our visit, I mean, not because of our visit, no connection, but I'll just say, the Germans did a complete U-turn and they started busing school children to the concentration camps to show them what had gone wrong in order to drive home the message of never again. That denial and brushing under the carpet is never an answer. You have to face up to what you've done, what your ancestors have done, what was done in your name. And that's something the Germans had the courage to do. The British have never faced up to what was done in their name. The massacres and atrocities, the 100,000 men, women, and children massacred in Delhi in 1858, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919, all of these things, absolutely ignorance, denial, brushing under the carpet, rose-tinted nostalgia. So that was the other thing. The third thing I said they could do is to actually commemorate. I mean, I actually remember one of the interviews I was giving during the promotions of the book, I drove past, believe it or not, a statue to the animals that had defended England and had died in the 2 world wars in defense of England. There isn't a single statue in England to any of the Indians, Africans, and so on, millions of them who had fought for the Allies in both the 2 world wars. And I said, face up to these things. You can honor your animals, you can't honor the Indians, I mean, who gave their lives for you and were never much appreciated back home because obviously they were fighting for a foreign law. Yeah. So all of these things, and then I finally said, one simple thing you could do is just say sorry. I mean, an apology would go a very long way. And I was partly joking, but I said, send Meghan Markle over if nobody else wants to go. But the point is that it would be, because since everything was done in the name of the Crown, all these atrocities, let a representative of the Crown go and go and apologize. And of course, that never happened. In fact, I remember the then British High Commissioner telling me in Delhi, diplomatic reception took me aside and said, listen, we can't possibly say sorry to you because then we'd be having to say sorry to 130 countries. And I said, well, not entirely. I mean, let's face it, Singapore or Hong Kong were barren rocks before you conquered them, and through various forms you actually built them up. But India was one of the richest countries in the world, and in 1700, India accounted for 27% of global GDP. As late as 1800, 23%. You managed to not just take the word loot into your dictionaries, but also into your habits. And you exploited, expropriated, and drained India of so much wealth that you were able to build up yourself. I've quoted the writer Walpole, taking a horse carriage down a street in London and literally naming the houses built with Indian money. I've talked about how Jane Austen describes this gorgeous, comfortable, civilized life without mentioning at all that it was built on the slavery of black people and sugar plantations in the Caribbean. There is this total amnesia, but when you recognize what was done, when I spoke at Oxford, for example, I pointed out that they had named, I think it was their Wi-Fi password or something, for Gladstone, who was hailed as a great liberal. But his family was one of the families that actually benefited from the extraordinary British decision. They want credit for having abolished slavery in the 1830s. But instead of compensating those who had been enslaved, those who had lost their lives, those who had been transported against their will, they compensated the slave owners for being deprived of their property. That was the British record. And to my mind, a simple sorry was long overdue. Then, interestingly enough, at a later reception, High Commissioner came to me and said, you know what? Your thing, your demand for an apology has suddenly struck a chord, and it's working its way up the channel. I had said on television and speeches in England that the best occasion to do it was coming, and that was the centenary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. I said, you have to pick one occasion that epitomized much of what was horrible about the British Empire. This was it. 1,379 unarmed men, women, and children massacred brutally, just to quote-unquote teach them a lesson, without warning, no firing shots in the air, no ordering them to leave, and done with a deliberate cruelty and callousness where the only exit from Jallianwala Bagh was actually blocked by the soldiers, and the commander ordered them to fire. He said it was like a turkey shoot. And what's more, the cruelty that accompanied it, many didn't die. They were lying on the ground, writhing in pain. He barricaded the gates and wouldn't let the family members go in to tend to the wounded, not even give them water before they could die. And he watched these people die. Anybody who walked down a particular street, and any Indian, would have to crawl on his belly, could not walk erect, because on that street, allegedly an Indian missionary woman had been assaulted. The fact that she was then rescued by other Indians and taken to safety was never mentioned. It was one thing after another. And then, anyway, I won't go into Jallianwala Bagh, still makes my blood boil. But I said, so that the centenary of that was April 13th of 2019 would be a great day for an apology. So anyway, he said, look out for what's going to happen on that day. I don't know myself what will happen, but do. And sure enough, on that day, the then Prime Minister Theresa May made a statement in Parliament, but she couldn't bring herself to say sorry. She said, I regret the happenings of that day, or something like that. It's a long way of saying, we killed a lot of your people, innocent people, wrongly, and we're sorry, which would have been the thing to do. Many of you may know that the former Archbishop of Canterbury came and prostrated himself at Jallianwala Bagh in atonement. But the Archbishop of Canterbury is a man of God. He's not a man representing imperial might and conquest and so on. In fact, the religious types were kept out by the colonists. When the Spanish went out to conquer, they actually had this desire to convert the heathens into their faith, but the Brits never did. They first got there in 1614. The first bishop landed on Indian soil in 1820. They didn't want the religious types there because they knew they'd bring moral values with them. And these guys were about rapacity and loot and making money. So the missionaries were not part of the British conquest. But anyway, good old Archbishop of Canterbury at least prostrated himself on the floor and said, sorry, but I'm still waiting for somebody who has the authority to speak for the British government and people, or as I said, for the British Crown, to actually say sorry.
No, thank you so much for that very engaging sort of account of things that you sort of made a call for, and the way in which we got sort of like a half-baked response, if you could call it, from the British side. So, there are we can keep talking about the British Empire. There's so many questions that I do have that I would love to engage with you, but there's also, considering the time limit, one thing that I do sort of take it in a slightly different direction and think about these colonial era practices that you talk about, because you do a brilliant job of thinking about all of these quote-unquote benefits that the British Empire brought, and you systematically sort of dismantle each of these arguments. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how do these practices continue to influence global power dynamics today in the terms of the political as well as economic institutions that are around. And when I ask you this question, I don't ask you just in terms of somebody who has great authority over the history of the British Empire, who's written a book about it, but also as somebody who's worked on a global organization like the UN, which sort of feeds into this. It is a powerful economic and global institution.
Right, well, that's a vast topic, Avrati. I'm not sure we have time to do justice to it. First, on the question of the claims for the empire. I mean, the most famous cliched claim is they gave us the railways, right? They sort of built the railways. Well, first of all, there's the obvious reports, which I did use in the debate, that a lot of countries built railways without going to the trouble and expense of being colonized in order to do so. But quite apart from that, it was a gigantic colonial scam. Number one, it had nothing to do with the welfare of the Indians. The original note by Lord Dalhousie proposing that railways be brought to India was actually about how it would actually help extract more resources from the hinterland, bring them to the ports to ship to England, and would also enable soldiers to be sent to restive provinces to keep the Indians down. And nothing to do with transporting Indians around. That was not even in their minds. Secondly, when it was built, they saw a great opportunity to make profit off Indian taxpayers. I mean, at every level there was exploitation of Indian resources. And one of the things they did was they raised the money they sold the dividends in London, so it was the single most profitable investment you could make in the British Stock Exchange in those days, because they offered double the interest rates of British securities. So it was actually as safe as a British Treasury bond, but it gave you double the returns. And on top of that, they deliberately overspent because Indians were paying the money on the ground. So the result was railways were built in India in the 1850s and 60s at exactly the same time that railways were being built in the United States and Canada. But whereas each mile of railway here cost the equivalent of £2,000, each mile of railway in India cost £18,000, 9 times as much. And they did that purely because it was a classic case, as was described, of private profit at public risk, except the private profit was all to people in England, to white Englishmen, and the public risk was all to Indians and Indian taxpayers. So that was that was in the building of the railway. Then the running of the railways was an entirely white enterprise and continued to be so. Everybody from ticket collectors to engine drivers to station masters, everyone had to be a white Englishman, right up to the time when the First World War killed so many white Englishmen that there weren't enough left. And they then first turned to the Anglo-Indian community, and then eventually to finally opened it up to Indians. So that was the third thing. The fourth thing was that because of the unabashedly commercial purpose of the railways, what they did was they ended up giving themselves, British companies, the lowest freight rates in the world. Whereas the carriages they tacked on for Indian passengers who wanted to travel on the rails, which had these awful wooden benches that, and it was, worse than what today you would transport cattle in, were the highest passenger rates in the world. And that's how the British Railways were run. So nothing to do with the welfare of Indians, and certainly nothing for us to thank about. It was only after independence that we reversed the priorities and that we also built more lines of railways for the explicit purpose of serving Indian travelers. What else do you want? Rule of law? Rule of law was a travesty. They set up law courts, but they would not allow any Indians to judge white offenders. You had case after case, and I've gone through some of the records and given you examples, where Englishmen who killed Indians, and routinely, by the way, English employers would kick their servants to death, were let off. Whereas Indians who even raised their hands against the English were either given the death penalty or transported off to the Andamans, or in the earlier days to places like Singapore and so on. So it was a completely one-sided justice, and when one Viceroy, Lord Ripon, tried to reform it, there was such an outcry the poor man had to resign prematurely and go back to England. So no question of any justice in a meaningful sense. And the few Indians who studied in England, learned the law, came in and entered the legal profession, even became judges, all wrote very bitter memoirs about the way they were treated in the process. So rule of law, no marks there. What else do you want? The English language, yeah. The English language, which is what is enabling us to speak today, was not given to us by the English. They had no intention of giving it to the vast masses of the Indians. They wanted, as Macaulay's Minute on Education in 1835 makes crystal clear, to create a small class of intermediaries between the governors and the governed, between the British ruling classes and the Indian masses whom they needed. Some people who could understand local languages and sort of serve as a buffer, but they had no desire to impart knowledge, literature, ideas of political enlightenment and so on to the Indians. It so happened that it struck somebody, there's a wonderful thesis by a professor at Columbia, Gauri Vishwanathan, about this, that actually in order to overawe the Indians with the majesty of what the British had to offer, teaching literature would not be a bad thing. So actually the academic subject of English literature was invented in India. It did not exist before that. You went to Oxford or Cambridge, you learned the classics. English literature as a subject was invented in India in order to essentially convince the Indians that this was greater than anything their own civilization could produce. And anyway, so literature did come in. But for the rest, very little, and very few universities. In fact, Will Durant, the American historian, was shocked to discover as late as 1930 that the entire expenditure on education at all levels of the British government in India was lower than the high school budget of the state of New York in 1930. So they were spending as little as possible for as few people as possible. It was Indians who, seeing the advantages that could accrue from mastering the English language and subjects available in English, it was they who, so for the one British college established by the British in Calcutta, Raja Ram Mohan Roy established 9. You actually had people coming up and creating institutions paid for by Indians and meant to benefit Indians. But those were Indians doing it. And it was Indians who seized upon the English language to turn it into an instrument of resistance to British injustice, oppression, and colonialism. And so that small section of Indian society that did this was still small enough, but they were the ones who, if you like, expropriated back the language the English had brought to India and did not intend to give us for these purposes. And so it goes. I think the only thing I'm absolutely willing to concede is cricket, but that's another subject. You poor Americans will never really know the joys of that.
Thank you so much,
It's
Dr.
baseball
Tharoor.
with a PhD, just to get that. Sorry, yeah.
No.
Okay, but anyway, and on the global picture, frankly, I think the only danger in your question, and it's too vast a subject for us to go into, but the only danger there is for us in the developing world today to keep on using colonialism as an excuse for our actual governing failures.
Yes.
I think we should accept what was wrong and what was done wrong, and not, I always say let's forgive but not forget. Yeah. But then we have to move on, and we have to take accountability for ourselves. Now in India, we've been free for 77 years this year, and whatever's wrong with us today, as well as whatever's right with us, is on our own heads. We did it, and now it's I think enough time. There's a statute of limitations on blaming the colonials for what we're doing today. There are echoes. There's still some things we can talk about. And there's still some things we failed to change in colonial practices that lingered on in India that we could have changed earlier. But nonetheless, broadly speaking, I would say that it's time to move on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor.
Actually, there is one thing I should have said. When the book came out and Mr. Modi praised me, there was serious consternation in diplomatic circles in both countries, because he was about to make his first visit as Prime Minister to to England in September of that year. And my book came out, I've forgotten, my speech came out, I think, on the net in July of 2015. His remarks would have been made sometime in late July. So anyway, there was about a month and a bit to go, and he was going to go to England. And I said, consternation. Does this mean he's going to come and bash us in England? It'll go disastrous. And his speechwriter, who's now one of our ambassadors abroad, he called me and said, what do we do? Because he can't avoid this issue. So I suggested, look, why don't you say something along the lines of, others have addressed the wrongs of the past. I'm here to focus on the future. And he said, great idea, and that's more or less what the Prime Minister did when he got to England. So that was one echo, and I think that's today's relationship between India and Britain is between sovereign equals. Our economies are the same size in absolute terms, and in purchasing power ours is greater. And the same Theresa May we talked about came the waning months of her Prime Ministership to India to try and drum up Indian investment in Britain. So, I've often said, you don't need to revenge yourself upon history. History is its own revenge.
I think that's a fantastic note to sort of end our conversation. Of course, there are so many things to discuss, and we can keep talking about the legacy of the British Empire, but unlike the East India Company, I will not monopolize the riches of your wisdom to just satisfy my own curiosity and open the floor for audience questions.
I think you'll have to play traffic cop and pick them, right? Oh, there's a mic.
Let's start at the back. You on the. Okay.
Hi, I'm a recently graduated law student.
Okay.
I've shared your Oxford Union speech to pretty much anybody who would let me, and all the WhatsApp groups that all the families are in. So, in the 20th century, as you've talked about now and in all of your books, India was a model in smashing the chains of empire and pursuing democratic decolonization. My question is, in 2024, we live in a very different world, and India is a very different country. So and you alluded to this at the very end of your talk, what comes after decolonization for a country like India in the 21st century and all those other countries who suffered under inglorious empires? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a tough one, because I think each country's experience is somewhat different. I remember the Oxford debate, the Ambassador High Commissioner of Guyana was one of the speakers, and she was definitely keen on reparations. And I think when then Prince Charles went to the Caribbean, he met in a number of countries with open demands for give us money to make up for what you took from us. Whereas I said, in the Indian context, we've rather proudly turned down British aid, essentially saying that, we can manage our own problems ourselves, though I think British assistance to individuals charity to poor people, etc., could continue as human beings to others, because there is a lot of good that can be done still by that sort of assistance. But that apart, I would say that for us today, we need to draw a line. It's one of the arguments that the present government in India has continued to make since they were elected, is about the need for the decolonization of the mind. And I've talked about this in the past. Even before this book, I had called for Indian students, even in English medium schools, to be far more aware of the glories of ancient Indian science, achieve the greatness of a writer like Kalidasa, the excellent translations available. We should know Shakespeare, I'm not saying don't, but also know Kalidasa. We should know Mahabharata and Ramayana as epics that have so much resonance in our culture and society. Those of us who went through schooling in India actually knew about these things only from our grandmothers. We didn't actually ever hear references to them in school. Everything was, so there is some argument to be made there. But there's such a thing as drawing the line at some point and saying, change ABC and then forget about it, move on, look at the future. This government doesn't do that. They continue incessantly going on with this business of changing the names of places, for example. And, I can understand there's a good case for, where the British distorted an Indian name to make it easier for them to pronounce. Go back to the Indian name, no problem. You could have done this a long time ago, for that matter. Where a particular town bears a name of some obscure British administrator, colonist, whatever, surveyor, no harm at all. But, go on one renaming spree if you like, and then stop it, and then just say, look, we can live with the rest. I mean, there's certain, the problem is that all of these things become an excuse to cover up other governance failures. You distract people by talking about renaming rather than actually improving the urban amenities in those places that you're just busy renaming. Rather than dealing with sanitation and clean drinking water and waste management and all the boring, unglamorous daily headaches of governance that you're not prepared to do well, that sort of thing, one should not be allowed to mask the need for the other. There's a lot more one could say, but we have to let the others who's raising their hands.
Hi, so very impressive. What are your thoughts on British rulers' role in dividing up Indian subcontinent between India and Pakistan during separation?
Oh, I've written about that, and I'm obviously anguished about it, because we've been living with 77 years of hatred and division and unnecessary defense expenditure and wars and loss of lives, and now further recrudescence of bigotry within our own society, all of which were, as I've demonstrated in the book, consciously and deliberately sown by the British. There is absolutely no indication in Indian history until the British came of any such monolithic hostility between Hindus and Muslims. None whatsoever. Even the icons of the present rulers of India like to cite. For example, there's this huge sort of thing about the Battle of Haldi Ghati, where Maharana Pratap, the doughty Hindu hero, resisted the encroaching Mughal armies. Who commanded the Mughal armies? A Rajput general, Maharaj Man Singh. Who commanded Maharana Pratap's army? A Muslim, Hakim Khan Sur. And so what is the Hindu-Muslim lesson you derive from this? Shivaji, you want to portray him as this great Hindu resistor to Muslim imperial conquest. He had Maratha artillery he had Muslim artillery captains in the Maratha army. There were no monolithic things. There were history is replete. The historian Gyanendra Pandey has written about so many examples of temples being destroyed and Muslims helping repair them, shrines being damaged and Hindus going to pick them up, of Hindu worshippers and Sufi shrines all over the place. Too many examples of cooperation. Yes, there were examples of hostility as well, but not in a monolithic form. It was people fighting for advantages and so on. The British woke up in 1857 when all Indians of every religion united to try and overthrow the East India Company's rule, the British rule of India. And at the end of that, ruthlessly put down in an almost genocidal manner by the British, a minute was written saying, Divide et impera was the ancient Roman maxim, and it should be ours. Divide and rule. And the obvious division that occurred to the British was to make sure that Hindus and Muslims developed separate consciousness of each other. And they did that systematically. I found example after example after example. Even when the Indian National Congress was established by Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, and Christians, all together as a very civilized, very legal-minded, decorous submission of petitions, which were promptly filed vertically in the nearest wastepaper basket by the British. Nonetheless, the British said this could become dangerous because these people are becoming a voice of Indian nationalism. So they actually paid a few Muslim grandees to create a rival movement called the Muslim League. There is an episode documented that I've written about where the Nawab of Dhaka, when encouraged by the British to take a separatist position and asked for the partition was promised, said, what nonsense. He's an Oxford-educated man. He said, utter nonsense. Hey, we Hindus and Muslims have got along together for the longest time. And the British said, will £100,000 help change your mind? £100,000 those days is like £10 million today. And they gave him the money, no questions asked, and he changed his stand. I mean, it was a very systematic, deliberate effort to sow division. The British would not have dreamed of creating separate electorates for the Jews of Golders Green, but they created separate electorates for Muslims in India that only Muslims could vote for Muslim representatives, precisely in order to heighten the separate consciousness. And they did so even though they were offering grudgingly very limited franchise to the Indians. You had to have either education or property to be entitled to vote, and of course you had to be male. That was the slow accretion and you really got no real power because the British kept all the real powerful portfolios in their own hands. But it was kind of window dressing. Even for that window dressing, they had separate electorates. So it was creating consciousness that inevitably, yes, Indians played into that. They went along and they created separate consciousness. And the result was that by the time the Second World War came about, they really were two different groups. The Muslim League had never won a significant number of Muslim seats. All the Muslim majority provinces were ruled by parties that were syncretic. For example, Punjab was ruled by the Unionist Party, which was Hindus and Muslims, a big landlord party, agrarian interest. The Northwest Frontier province of what's today Pakistan was ruled by the Congress Party, and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was known as the Frontier Gandhi. Sindh was ruled by a Muslim party that was anti-Muslim League and partition. The chief minister, man called Allah Bakhsh, was hugely popular. He was assassinated during the height of the separatist agitations. Anyway, all of this is worth knowing because it's again the direct result of conscious British imperial policy. But inevitably then, when World War II came and the Congress leadership went to jail, the Muslim League happily took the opportunity to assume power, the seats to which they had not been elected, the Congress had been elected, and dramatically increased their membership through patronage and pelf. They went from 2 lakh members to 20 million in the course of the Second World War. And by the time the Congress were released from jail in 1945, at the end of the war, the advantage had slipped from their hands. And the elections of 46, the Muslim League for the first time swept the Muslim seats. And then partition and Pakistan became inevitable. And this was very, very much deliberate British policy. And there's so many documents about how they believed that the Muslims would be more sympathetic to the British and therefore you needed a Muslim country because these dangerous sort of leftist Hindus would be, I'm sorry, be getting all these warning messages for me to shut up. So anyway, short answer, yes, it was deliberate policy to divide and rule, and it succeeded. But this tragic, the shambolic Brexit in 1947 by the British retreating in unseemly haste led to 1 million people being killed in the riots that accompanied their departure and 13 million displaced. So one of the great human tragedies over which you can squarely blame the British. No one.
Hardly surprising that we cannot get enough of your oratory, and we have so many questions to ask you, but unfortunately, this is our time. Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor, for a very engaging conversation. And
Thank you, Avrati, for igniting whatever I had to say so well. Thank you. Sorry about all those hands that went up. Take care.